getting his coffee just ready. We thought it'd be a good time to start. I think we're piping out across all the various systems at this point. So we'll show up eventually in each of them. Maybe we'll have some excitement like we did last week where YouTube decided to kind of just
It was
be the
Facebook.
front runner so
Yeah.
that Facebook could fall behind. But it'll get there. Hey, we're on YouTube, and so we're just going to roll. Like YouTube just sent me the notification. We're good to go. Everything else will pop up. You know, is it? Well, they're all good. We're online, man. We're solid.
We're
Coming
solid.
in 5x5. If you want to use those old terminologies. Hey, it's important right now for me to indicate something of significance to modern era rarities. Modern era rarity number one. A wonderful Florida College Society has triumphed in the annual society competition.
Very rare.
Second reality is the method of their victory. One of their crowning achievements was the capstone endeavor to give the most service hours. That's typically not a strength for Omega, but apparently they've decided to be overachievers this year, and we support them in their victory. Terry didn't get the notice ahead of time. I'm sure if he had had the opportunity, the entire room would be decked out in swag, but it was just announced today. So there's your news report for the day.
By the way, that's the key always to winning societies in SC history is your service hours, because the first shall be last and the last shall be first.
Yeah, there may be a weighting system in play that adjusts those things.
There's more. There is, at least when we were there and I was president, more weight is given to your service hours than sports, which is interesting because most students only think about societies with sports.
Yeah, there's four or five categories that they kind of evaluate. The three strongest ones that you can think of are going to be academics, service hours, and sports. And the weighting system goes service
participation.
hours,
participation.
Yeah, academics, sports. Yeah. Sports is the least. This is our Sunday morning attire right here. I will say James has been lobbying for me to pull out my Filipino shirt jack and wear that on Sunday morning at some point. I keep reminding him that it's almost the equivalent of a suit or a tuxedo in some context, and actually a little too fancy.
I want you to preach in your kilt.
I have while in kilt read Bible. Does that count? I read scriptures.
Have you done a wedding in the kilt? Like performed a wedding in the kilt? That, my friend.
No, I have been in multiple weddings.
In the kilt. I know that. You stood up in the kilt.
But I don't think I have. I have no recollection of performing a kilted wedding ceremony.
Bucket list, my friend. Bucket list.
Hey, look, if someone needs their wedding done and we can work out some good circumstances everyone's comfortable with, I'm absolutely happy to do that. There's no barrier on my part, especially if we can find a great photographer to come in and do some top quality photography. I'm in.
Be fantastic.
100% support. It's good to have Chris and Jeff and others hopping in. Terry and I have been talking back and forth, different ideas, and Terry suggested a really good topic today. It kind of connects some puzzle pieces from our own pasts and some things that are relevant to preaching today. And Terry, why don't you go ahead and introduce our topic, even though our title says what it is.
Yeah, I mean, just it's a little bit more lighthearted maybe than sometimes, and it allows a lot of variety, and we'd love to have the audience to participate with our topic. But the idea here is just simply, what could you tell yourself if you could go back and tell you 20 years ago? What could you tell yourself? What would you tell yourself? And I think that's going to have some interesting kind of things going on there, and look forward to the discussion. So, because a lot of things have changed in the last 20 years. So I could kick it. I've wrote a few down, but one of them I could kick off, which was, I think the number one thing, if I could tell myself 20 years ago to change, would be to stop buying actual books and invest in Logos. I joined that train way too late. And oddly enough, I'm not sure when I invested in that. It might have been close to 20 years, but it's probably about 15. But it was more like I got it and did nothing with it for close to 10, except use it for copy and paste function, which it does. But if you spend that much money just to copy and paste Bible passages, you've wasted your money. So that's my number one, would be to start transitioning to your digital library sooner. And that may be odd because of the books behind me. I will say about the books behind me that all the green ones up there were my father's books, so those will never go away. There's a tremendous sentimental value in the old college press commentary set, and so I will always have those. But as a whole, that would be my first thing, Phil, would be to invest digitally sooner. Because I will say this to those who would challenge that. And this is, I started using Logos better because of Phil's influence, truthfully. It is easier to study, and it is easier to have everything in one source when you know how to use it. And I'm just using probably 5% of what the software can do, truthfully, but the impact it makes on taking one text and just tearing that apart and adding notes in and being able then to quickly reference those is phenomenal in comparison to trying to drag a stack of books over to your desk. So that's my number one, Phil, which largely, again, is your influence. Sadly.
I don't want to talk about that last comment. I will say this. I got on the digital space earlier than some. Like, there are people who are way ahead of me for sure. But I wish I would have had more of an intentional process in that transition. Part of that was the reason I was there is because I didn't have much money to buy books in general. Yeah. Some mid-level commentaries were starting to be produced for free online. And so I could get access to those. And it was out of necessity rather than intention.
eSword was my first introduction because the guy who developed it lived nearby me.
Yeah.
And the Henry, the Clark, that kind of stuff was free domain at that point.
Right.
Which is probably the stuff you're referring to.
Yeah, that and Kaufman's stuff came out online for free. And then I bought a program that was absorbed into Logos, and that pulled me into Logos out of BibleWorks, because I used BibleWorks until I couldn't anymore, until it wouldn't function on my Macs. And I'm like, I can't buy a BibleWorks for Mac anymore because the company folded. And so I had to pick one, and I already was invested into Logos because of prior purchases. And so I was like, this is where I'm going. Even though I think probably it's not too difficult to say that Accordance is a little bit better on its language tools than Logos is. If you're coming from BibleWorks, which was at the time the premier biblical language software suite. It really does some things then that Logos still couldn't do now. So yeah, I think that was something I would say all of us probably could have looked at and said, yeah. Now I want to be a little bit of a curmudgeon to some degree and still say, like Terry, there are certain things that books excel at. There are certain times when reading out of a physical book, like your Bible, is just way better. But for design study, like we're trying to build something from your resources and research, then absolutely.
And by the way, I get it. I love holding a book, Phil, and I love the sound of a page turning when I'm using a book. I like that stuff. But for intense study where I can just want to cram as much into a couple of hours without having to, the digital platform stuff, whether it's Logos, Accordance, or whatever, it's hard to beat.
Yeah,
it really is hard to beat.
So I would probably also then say something like this. Back 20 plus years ago, I remember having a conversation with an older preacher, and I asked him a similar question. I said, hey, what would you do differently if you could go back? And he didn't have anything he wanted to talk about in that larger conversation. I will say this. I think one of the things that I think would be important to do if I could go back and say, hey, what would I do differently in this area, is learn to build relationships with a larger space of Christians around me. for all kinds of reasons. We all created these little silos that were away from one another.
Yeah.
I think in the end, that actually made the differences that were legitimately there worse, not better. And a relationship is different than fellowship. Like you can talk to one another and yet understand that there are substantial doctrinal and theological differences that you're working out. And if I can go back, that would be
sometimes, yeah, sometimes, Phil, because 20 years ago, you and I were different silos, even though we probably would have considered ourselves to be even in fellowship with each other. But because of other influences, we were in different little contained areas. And thankfully, we've gotten past that, I think. They weren't theological differences. You and I were not theologically different, even though we were disassociated. And I think both of us regret that time period. And I would have told myself 20 years ago to make that different. Arrear's point about Pokemon cards just made me chuckle. But Emerson's point, one of the things I wrote down was is to not trust your heritage. And that kind of goes along with what Emerson's saying. That was kind of my thought. 20 years ago, I was convinced that there was a lot of Church of Christ things I had to force into my preaching. And 47-year-old Terry Francis is a lot better at just taking the text and preaching it. And that the truth is what matters, not some kind of heritage associated with the truth. And I think that's important as well, not to bend things, as he says, to make a brotherhood checkbox. I think that's important. And I did not do that well 20 years ago. I mean, you talked about the silos, and Phil, you know this. We were influenced by these groups of men we had surrounded ourselves with that were mentors, and we're thankful for those good men, and we're thankful for those mentors. And we want to be that for other young men. That's one of the reasons we do this video. And I will say this, those men were not just good men. They were good men with good intentions who were doing the best they could for what they understood to be going on at the time.
Yeah.
And I don't fault them. I'm not saying that they were sinning. And I want to make that very clear. They were reacting to the issues that they saw as very important. And I'm not even saying they weren't important. But in the process, some of us were kind of told, you have to preach on these, 8 or 10 things every year. You got to hammer this home.
Yeah.
And looking back, that doesn't dictate my preaching anymore. And what I mean by that is I will deal with those 8 to 10 things, Phil, when they come up in the text or they come up naturally, but not some forced listing of things I'm required to do as a part of my heritage. And that's a different approach.
Yeah, here's 2 things that I would add, that like lessons learned. Number 1, I still would encourage younger self to read every bit of restoration literature, even up to the stuff that was present tense amongst the churches I was connected to and I'm still connected to. Like, you still want to read all that because you need that knowledge. It gives you a sense of the community you're part of and where people are coming from. But on the same token, learn to realize that they're still in that community, and so are you. And that community influences you in many ways. And my illustration of that is that if you think about it, gospel meetings from say 1995, when I started taking notes about gospel meetings as a student at Florida College, to 2005 or even 2015, how many of the Wednesday nights were about the home?
Yeah.
That I did or others did, when maybe that wasn't the choice that was best for the meeting itself. I really think that's important to incorporate. And to Jeff's point about Pokemon cards, man, I got a box of Pokemon cards too, but I'm saving those on the off chance that one of those becomes valuable.
You're gonna hit the lottery with the Pokemon card?
Oh yeah. We've got the kids collections. We got some donations from some college kids. They're all sorted out. We got some low level rares. You never know what's going to happen. Stuff gets popular.
That's right.
That's not a big save. Like I'm not a big stuff guy, but that one doesn't take up a lot of space. And so that shoebox can be around for a while.
I might have told you 20 years ago, instead of buying a box of Pokemon cards, to invest in like some
Apple.
startup company like Twitter,
Yeah, yeah, Twitter.
yeah, yeah.
Back then, you could buy into Apple pretty cheap.
Yeah, yeah. Emerson talking about fighting the battles in front of you. That is something that I did learn. I think that's something, by the way, that might have been a differentiation in the two kind of groups we were in of our influence, where I I was instructed early on by my foremost mentor. Don't preach to the kingdom at large, preach to the church you're with. Don't introduce things that aren't problems.
Yeah,
Um, Even though you're told we got to preach on this. And that was wise advice I did listen to uh, really
that's a rare
25
double.
years ago.
Wise
Yeah, yeah.
advice,
Wise advice, and I listened.
and you listen.
Um, and yeah, so I mean, from that standpoint, yes, that's still great advice. Don't hop on the bandwagon. Now, there's times I didn't follow that really well. I mean, all of us had a Da Vinci Code sermon, and I look back at that and just kind of grieve a little bit, or remember when they found the Jesus tomb? There's another one, the History Channel Jesus tomb special.
Or the James
Uh,
Ossuary. Did you ever
yeah,
learn about
these were great Sunday night sermons, by the way. That was the thing. Yeah,
high flying?
yeah. I will say my favorite part of my Da Vinci Code sermon was taking the Last Supper and being able to spell out Terry with the different lines in it. I thought that was super clever at the time.
That's not bad.
So yeah.
Here's another thing that I think is important, and it ties together some learning points. Don't lose yourself in the lessons. Don't lose yourself in the work. There's a couple of points that I connected where I started making self-aware knowledge points. Like Raymond Castillo came and held us a gospel meeting, and he told me something that I didn't believe about myself. In that he said that you have a good sense of who you are and you don't contain it. And I'm like, well, I felt like I was. I was driving a big truck, so I like big trucks. I'm a big guy. He identified that as like having my personality. There's an edge of that. That's true. But there was a lot of me that was being subjugated under a shell that I had built. And there's something important that in preaching, you've got to still retain your self identity.
Don't be a fake.
It's not even about being fake or not. It's allowing the gospel to transform you as it intends.
Well, what I mean by don't be a fake is there's a part where you don't fit this model of somebody you're not, because that is being fake. And show that you can change and so that you can be transformed and still retain your personality. Be Phil and a disciple. Don't be somebody else.
Right. And Terry made me have to do an edit because he decided to go one step above, and so I had to edit and add the full years of service.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is really important too. Is sooner bring joy to your life. Make things in your preaching, in your work, in your community as a local church that produce or allow for rejoicing in a variety of contexts, whether it's going out and arranging opportunities for Christians to get together and go do stuff. We did that a lot in Tennessee, but doing that in Oregon and in Louisiana would have been bonuses to the work. Like let's really build some joy in those communities beyond the potluck. And that's a great sermon title that just came to my mind. Fellowship beyond the potluck. I'm gonna have to write that down. You guys can use that too, or it's bad, and you can use it as well. Either way. And so, like things like that don't seem to have this technical aspect are great lessons that you can turn back to, because I could tell myself, hey, do more expository work. Read this book, read that book. But in general, these principled things, I think, are stuff that are super important. And I'll add one more thing that this is super personal in this regard. Finish your degree sooner. Like if I could tell myself back, finish your degree sooner. because it's important to you, not because it's important to anybody else.
I have my degree. It's right there. It's AA. I'm good.
Yeah. But no, this is my lesson, not your lesson.
I'll give you one. Be hospitable and stop worrying what people think about your house.
Yeah.
Just have people in your home. There's nothing that connects you to people more. We could try to say that going out to eat at a restaurant is the same thing. It's just not. When you bring people into your home, you open up, you're vulnerable. And, so we've learned, hey, look, hey, come over and eat. Our laundry's still on the dining room table because that's where we fold it, but we don't care. That's just, we live here. This is not a house that's on the market. You're going to see dust. You're going to see dog hair because we have 3 dogs. Come on over. Let's have dinner and hang out. Just deal with it. That's my house. My wife is a school teacher. It is what it is. You come on Sunday, you're going to get a cleaner house than if you stop by Tuesday night. And that's okay because we live here. And I think as a young couple, we probably worried about that way too much. And wasted some opportunities to get to know people a lot better because we were pride is a big part of that.
Our house doesn't have a lot of stuff in it. And so you come over at any point in time.
Yeah.
There's nothing going on in here because, we don't
sell your house short, man. You got a nice house. I stayed there. You get nice digs and your wife does a good job. So
she works hard. I do the outside. I've got enough molds right now to go watch it.
The fox is taking care of your outside.
Hey,
I got another one. And Emerson's going to love this one, by the way, I think. Stop being negative about preaching and discouraging young men from preaching. Like, I think there was a time in my life where I would be like, people would be like, she preach, man, do anything but preach, and I think we've all had those moments where we're negative about it, but and it's been to the detriment of the kingdom because, as we talked about last week, there's a shortage, right, Phil? We know of probably 20 to 30 churches right now that can't find anybody across the country. We know 10 in one area that can't find anybody. Some of them have been looking for a year or two. And I confess that there was a time I contributed to that by telling kids, man, you don't want to do this, that was not helpful. And so, right, Paul, you're right. Like we complain about it because we don't think about how hard it was, and Paul's still encouraging Timothy and Titus to preach. So stop being negative, even when you are upset. Keep your mouth shut about it, because the reality is, it's still. I don't know about you, Phil, but there's nothing else I'd rather do than what I'm doing. I'm blessed to do this. It hit me Sunday because Sunday it hit me all week. Sunday, we had worship Sunday afternoon. We had a small group meeting and we met at the park and played games with a bunch of the kids and had a great biblical discussion and a meal together. And last night at my daughter's last soccer game, there were about close to 10 people from church that showed up to support her on her last high school game. All little girls. They made signs for her. And, generally speaking, if I was working in some secular environment, I'm not getting that in the same way that I'm getting here. So it's just I think that there's a need to tell yourself when you're younger and when you're frustrated, just keep your mouth shut about it, because things are better than you think they are at your worst moment.
Yeah. Something else to think about is, stop getting in the way of yourself.
Yeah.
I think 20-year-old me set some barriers in front of myself that said I can't do this. And one of those is I had kind of convinced myself that I should be careful writing. I should wait until I knew more so that when I write, I could say more. Unfortunately, what that produces is someone who doesn't write as well as they could if they had written more. And so all I had to have changed was where I had chosen to publish. Now, every preacher writes every Sunday. Like, no matter how you produce your sermon, you are writing your sermon, whether it's an
Yeah.
outline, whether you read a scripture and you've got it all in your head, you still wrote it. You just didn't put pen to paper. But the mechanical process of learning to edit your comments to a digestible form only gets better through practice. And so, as a young preacher, more writing would have been something that I think I go back and say, man, you need to do this because you'll actually be thankful for it down the road.
Right.
And that you don't.
Writing actually improves your preaching. I mean, I think when I've worked with young guys, the number one way we actually improve their preaching is through their preparation. And the number one way to do that is actually making them write good bulletin articles. And if I could teach a young guy how to write a good, solid bulletin article, it will impact his preaching in a way that you just don't understand. But I've seen it happen multiple times. And I think that's really, really important. In fact, I think it's one of the main reasons I still put up with a local bulletin is it forces me to keep writing. Even if it's just a 500-word article every week, that still forces me to keep writing, which is an integral part of my work. I mean, there's a part of us feel that we are speech writers, whether we want to admit it or not.
Five paragraphs a day isn't going to kill you.
Right.
You know,
I would tell you another one I would tell myself is just to keep your mouth shut. And
yes,
listen.
hold on a second. Paul, you absolutely would.
Yes, absolutely.
As someone
if you want to get under the 45-minute mark, here's the two
Because
things you do. Yeah, you want to get under the 45-minute mark. Here's the two things I would tell you to do right now is first, write more, and second, write everything you're going to say before you say it in a sermon. Because when most guys that go 45 minutes are my friends who just do an outline and talk extemporaneously. And that may not be you, but that's a lot of guys. Right?
Yeah.
And you just get up and you get lost
without
in
an
talking.
outline.
Yeah.
That's me without a manuscript.
Yeah,
straight
absolutely.
Up. 100% of the time.
If I don't hold myself to under 5 minutes extemporaneously, it could easily be an hour and a half. That's the problem. But again, back to what I was going to say. Listen more, keep your mouth shut more. And those are two huge things for a young man. I did not do that well. And just to be honest, Phil, you know this, we talked about this. It probably took me getting fired to fully grasp that. So that's a relatively new lesson. So I think that's important. And Paul, doesn't do you good to write it if you don't stick to it.
Yeah.
You're failing the assignment.
This is a piece of advice that was given to me that I absolutely embraced for a number of factors. Was your family does come first.
Yes.
Gospel meetings, second. Other stuff that is church associated, second. Because your family comes first. And I say church associated, got like attending seminars, studying, all that research stuff, all those things. They need to be in a first priority place. And so you need to be not only available, but imminently present. Like you are there and engaged.
Phil, you know who taught me that about gospel meetings? I don't know if I've ever told you this. I think I have. It was our buddy Gerald, also known as Bubba Gardner. Bubba was a guy who could have held 12 meetings a year probably if he wanted to, for a lot of reasons. Bubba held only 4.
Yeah.
And early on, he made that commitment to his family. And there was a year that I had 9 meetings. And there was a part of me when I saw that schedule that thought, man, look at how great I am, because that's one of the dangers of meetings. Okay. And I was younger, a lot younger. And it wasn't long after that. First off, that was a really hard year being gone that much. My kids were still young. And Bubba and I talked about it, and he told me that. And I never did 4 meetings after that, more than 4 meetings after that, because of not even locally. I wouldn't make exceptions because I wanted to put my family first. It was hard on my wife. And then when it came time, I went even further, because when it came time for Peyton's senior year, when I knew he was going to play every Friday night, I told those guys where I had meetings, I won't be there on a Friday night. Like, if you want to have a week-long meeting, you're going to have to either find a guy to just come in on Friday night and me not be there, or you're just going to have to cancel with me, because my son, this is his last season of playing football, and I'm not going to miss a game.
Yeah.
I'm not, because I'm in control of that. And I know not everybody agrees with that, but for me, it was the right decision because my family came first. And I don't regret that at all, Phil, of making those changes to make sure I could be there for my son. And I think that's important advice there. We were talking about meetings earlier, and Chris just said it's not about that. It's not. I don't have a lot of meetings because of COVID, and I'm okay with that. We were talking about that earlier.
It's it's whatever it is that you're going to use as an excuse to disconnect.
Right.
And it can be any number of things. For me, I kind of took that all to heart too, and shifted away from meetings to doing evangelistic trips every couple of years because that was easier to manage. Like we could plan for it and it's not too bad. And now it's kind of adjusted into overseas educational tours, going to
Which
Israel.
eventually you'll take some of your family with you on.
Yeah. And so I'm opening the doors to a year or two from now, Jesse may tag along and go back to the Philippines with me. Like that's a thing that could happen. And James is ready to go now. If it was up to him, he's ready to rock and roll. I think Hallie would go too. She's up for the adventure. And that may happen. But these are things that now fit in that space. And I think while you can have the principle, and Ron Halbrook is the one who really laid that on me hard. And he was the guy who was doing 12 to 15 meetings and a month and a half over in the Philippines, but his kids were already out of the home. And he's saying, look, like when your kids are in the home, you don't need to do that. And he was also reflecting on it from his own personal experience that, hey, he could have stayed home more and should have. I really think that's something that's important.
Along with that, and this is something I did because my mentor, Wilson Adams, was really good at this with his kids. And I would just tell preachers along with that about putting your family first, be intentional about making memories that are going to last. I think that's the other problem we have sometimes is we don't really make true memories sometimes. Wilson would do things with his kids. Like he took Dale one time to the Field of Dreams in Iowa just to play catch or whatever.
Yeah.
And you think about those kind of things, like you find the experiences that my family's more sports oriented. So like Jillian and I have seen the U.S. women's national team play soccer live. Your family is more outdoor sports oriented. So there are things you've done with your boys through scouting or things with Hallie that you've done that are memories your kids will never forget. So it's not just about being home. It's also about taking the opportunity to make connections with your own kids. And part of that, I think, by the way, is you are an evangelist to your children too. You got to connect to your kids to be able to save their soul. And all of that goes into that. If they're just on the back burner and they're not important, you're going to struggle to do that. So I think that's important too, just to say from a life lessons experience.
Yeah, these are all things that categorically are woven into what makes an evangelist effective. In the big sense of things, because your heart has to beat at the core of everything you do. And that heart is being transformed by Christ in ways that will help you become the disciple you need to be. If you start carving out chunks of it and say, I don't need that part of who I am, you're never going to do the things that God needs you to do. You're going to end up being some malformed outcome that may meet somebody else's expectations, but it's not going to meet God's. And I think that's really something that should have been easy for me to grasp in the big picture. Hey, be yourself. But the application of it became hard. Or, these other kind of key points of looking back and thinking through, hey, how can I do this better, more effectively? How can I engage in a way that encourages this church to be more than they are?
Yeah. Absolutely.
I got one last one. This is my last one. Turn off cable news.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
Like
yes.
Now.
Yes.
I saved that for the end.
Yes.
It doesn't matter. Ain't nothing going to come good of that.
Ain't nobody got time for that. That's what you need to do. Yes. Listen, we're out of time though. Honestly, it's been great. It's been lighthearted. Phil, just a reminder, like you've been given, we're probably going to go about two. We've not had a hard, fast deadline, but I'm imagining about 2 or 3 more weeks. I mean, things are about to get crazy.
Yeah, one
Things
more
about to
week.
get crazy for us with two girls graduating, and
Yep.
just thinking about that I've got, a open house graduation party and then graduation, and then it's a lot going on in
Yep.
May, but we're certainly going to take June, July, and August off, for sure. But I will say this about this whole discussion today. I wanted to end by saying this, that the one thing I am aware of is I am thankful for everything that has happened to me up until this point in my life, because whether good or bad, and whether it's been positive or negative, everything that I've been through as a person has helped me grow into what I am today. And even your darkest hours help mold you and shape you into who you are now. And I think I'm a better person today than I was 2 years ago, than I was 10 years ago. And I've got a long way to go, but always be grateful for the experiences, even if you don't think they were the best, because they play a role in developing you as a person today. And that's
Yeah.
important. And don't discount that. That's important.
All right. So next week will be our last broadcast for the season, if you will, because I'll be in Israel after that. And like Terry said, right after that, we've got all the graduation festivities.
It's crazy time.
So we'll see you guys next Tuesday. If there's some way we can help you, encourage you, and strengthen you in your work, let us know.